Secretary Reich, can you hear us?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Robert Reich. Yesterday, Fed policymakers continued their battle against inflation with a third straight supersized rate increase, warning that they will continue to raise borrowing costs. They assume that the underlying economic problem is a tight labor market, causing wages to rise and prices to rise in response. So interest rates and interest rate increases are necessary to slow wage growth. With due respect, this assumption is wrong. Recent wage hikes have not kept up with inflation. Most workers' paychecks are shrinking in terms of real purchasing power. Rather than causing inflation, wages are reducing inflationary pressures. The underlying economic problem, in addition to global problems, is not wage price inflation, it's profit price inflation. That is, corporations raising their prices above increases in their costs, using those cost increases as excuses to raise their prices and profits. Corporate profits are close to levels not seen in over a half century. Corporations have the power to raise prices without losing customers because they face so little competition. Since the 1980s, 2/3 of all American industries have become more concentrated. Grocery prices are through the roof, for example, largely because just 4 companies control 85% of meat and poultry processing, and 4 giants control 70% of grain. 1 corporation sets the price for most of the nation's seed corn. 2 firms dominate consumer staples. All are raising prices and increasing profits because they can. Meanwhile, Big Pharma is increasing drug prices like mad. The airline industry has gone from 12 carriers in 1980 to just 4 today, which are rapidly raising ticket prices. Wall Street has consolidated into 5 giant banks, raking in record profits on higher spreads. Broadband is dominated by 3 giant cable companies that are raising their fees, and so on. With inflation driven by these conglomerates raising prices to increase their profit margins, the major effect of interest rate hikes is just to depress wages and limit jobs. As the economy slows, workers are even less likely to get wage increases that keep up with inflation. And unemployment is going to rise. The Fed now sees the unemployment rate rising to 4.4% next year, up from 3.7% now. That would mean the loss of 1.2 million jobs. I urge Congress and the administration to take direct action against this profit price inflation, rather than rely solely on the Fed to raise interest rates and put the burden of fighting inflation on average working people who are not responsible for it. First, a windfall profits tax would help. A temporary tax on price increases exceeding the producer price index's costs of producing consumer goods. Congress should also direct the Federal Trade Commission to investigate whether price increases reflect added costs or opportunistic price gouging. Second, bold antitrust enforcement is essential. Even the credible threat of antitrust enforcement can deter corporations from raising prices higher than their costs. And third, as a backstop, price controls should be considered. Now, it's true they have many disadvantages in terms of distorting markets, but the current inflation emerging from the pandemic is analogous to the inflation that occurred right after World War II, when economists argued for temporary price controls on important goods to buy time to overcome supply bottlenecks and prevent corporate profiteering. They should be considered now for the same reasons. In sum, the inflation we are now experiencing is not due to wage gains. It is due to increases in corporate profits. And it's excessive profits, not wages, that need to be controlled.
Dr. Reich, in Dr. Goodspeed's analysis, he claims that $1.9 trillion ARP stimulus package is what caused a spike in inflation in March 2021. However, it was a clear minority of the spending that had happened by April of 2021. Why would you just focus on the ARP as opposed to the Family First Act, the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which dispersed far more money than what had happened with the ARP by April 2021?
Mr. Chairman, there's no reason to focus on the ARP. I want to add, though, and this is an important consideration, the ARP did a lot of good. It kept Americans afloat. It made sure that a lot of Americans did not fall into poverty at one of the most critical and difficult periods of time we have had in this country over the last century in terms of a public health crisis. It did a lot of good. And the other thing is that we've seen that after all of the CARES Act, the ARP, all of the other structures that we put into place, a lot of that is now gone. A lot of American families are now back to where they were before, although jobs are plentiful. Note that employers are not raising wages as high as inflation. Wages and wage gains continue to trail inflation, which means that most families, particularly low-income families, but even middle-class families, are falling further and further behind.
So, Secretary Reich, it's been nearly a decade since you released the documentary Inequality for All, in which you sounded the alarm about harmful corporate practices. How has the relationship between worker productivity and wages changed since then?
So, Congresswoman, I wish I could say that there was a dramatic difference in the relationship, but actually we've seen that worker productivity has continued to rise, but wages have continued to stay relatively flat, adjusted for inflation. In fact, what we've seen recently is that even though inflation continues to rise, those worker wages are still relatively flat. Employers are complaining they can't find workers. Well, there is a way to find the workers. Raise pay. They won't do it. They'll raise the prices of their goods, but they're not raising their wages.
So as a follow-up, Secretary Reich, given the historical disparities between Black and white unemployment levels, can you estimate how the Federal Reserve's policies will impact Black workers?
Yes, undoubtedly, the Fed's continuing rate increases are not only flirting with a recession, but they are making it harder for workers, particularly Black workers who are disproportionately low wage, to get income increases, to get wage increases. And one of my biggest fears is because Black workers are disproportionately low wage, they are also disproportionately going to be the first fired when we head into an economic slowdown. This is a problem for Black workers. It's a problem for the working poor. It's a problem for the lower middle class. These are the people who are drafted into the fight against inflation when we rely solely on the Fed and on interest rate hikes to control inflation.
Thank you for your explanation and for being so clear and concise and speaking the truth.